While they walked through the sewers, Vincent wouldn't shut up. What he was talking about was so low and simply boring that it would be sadistic of me to pass it on you on this podcast, dear listeners. Enough to say that Wilbur, out of reasons no different than self-respect, did not listen to him either. Instead, he couldn't help but wonder if the existing situation helped his plight or not. Is being unarmed and taken hostage an advantage in the eyes of that creature? Or is moral judgment not something he'd like to be bothered with? He knew that his mind couldn't possibly come up with a satisfying solution, but which one of us can turn our minds off whenever we want to? Sometimes you've got to listen to a guy, even while knowing very well he won't have anything interesting to say. And sometimes you don't. Especially if said guy is Vincent-like. They finally arrived at a little wooden door with lit torches on each side. It was one of the cult places scattered around the sewers. Wilbur did not remember what specifically they worshipped in that shrine, and he didn't care that much. In the end, all cults are crazy and insanely dangerous. If what you believe in gives you some juicy rewards when you die doing some crazy stuff, you're very likely to do it. And that's precisely why they were so dangerous. Knock knock, Wilbur! That probably meant that Wilbur's job was to knock, so he did so. Ridiculous, he thought to himself. But no one opened the door. Nor he could hear any blasphemous prayers behind it. It was only silence and the awful stench of his abductor. Looks like you were wrong again, friend. If this means you didn't get both of us killed, I'll be very happy, Wilbur replied harshly, and Vincent tossed him aside and started picking a lock. That was a thing to admit, he could do so rather well. It took him only a moment and the door opened up before them. Ta-da! He uttered, filled with self-satisfaction. They went inside and Vincent, with his blade ready to strike, carefully walked between the columns, looking for any danger. As for the place itself, it was dirty and awful, but also kind of impressive. Glyph-decorated columns towered before them, which led to a statue of a man with 4 arms holding a different weapon in each of them. The statue was carved very carefully by a very talented hand that was, by all means, mad just like every other worshipper in here. There was a plate filled with gems and gold just on the footstep of the 4-armed god. Vincent certainly noticed it, but dared not to get too close. Not just yet. He checked every corner he could carefully and, while gasping and murmuring to himself, pulled the bag out of his pocket and started to put silver cutlery inside. Wilbur watched him, not daring to try to escape. Vincent knew these sewers almost as good as one knows its own house. He also did not have tools to fight him without guarantee of winning, not without his staff at least. Then Wilbur noticed something that made him worry for no reason he could rationally explain. There was a large hole just above the statue. It might have been there before, it probably served no purpose, but considering their circumstances, it made his heart beat harder. Hurry up! He shouted to Vincent, but he was completely lost in the treasures he was putting in his bag. Then he stepped in front of the statue. He stood before it, laughed shortly, and spat on it, then put his hands on some treasures that were on a plate. And, surprise, surprise, that's when the trouble began. Out of nowhere, voices started shouting. shouting one word that was difficult for Wilbur to decipher. It sounded like a name in a foreign language. The voices echoed all around the place. Suddenly, he noticed cultists in black and red robes revealing themselves from behind the columns, surrounding Vincent, now shocked and disoriented. Wilbur pressed his back against the wall. Could he make it to a door in time? This thought got cut short by another cultist entering through said door and locking it behind him. He noticed Wilbur, but did not pay attention to him. All of them closed in a circle around the thief. Vincent flayed his blade around as much as his short arm would allow him, trying to threaten the oncoming priests. But they did not feel intimidated. They raised their hands and kept repeating the same word while raising their eyes towards the hole that in such an absurd manner threatened Wilbur so much. And, just so happened, that threat was real. From the hole just above the four-armed man statue, the beast climbed down. The massive, four-legged creature, its whole body cloaked in scales and head and arms swathed in black feathers. It had long, curved talons that were thick and glimmered like well-polished swords, and a massive head filled with 3 rows of teeth, all covered in a dark, viscous substance that dripped on poor Vincent, who could only look at it, palsied with fear. The beast climbed down onto the statue so gently that it couldn't be heard at all. Also, considering its size, it could turn the statue over just by placing one of its limbs in it. Instead, it seemed to sit on it rather comfortably. From this position, still surrounded by its loyal cultists screaming its impossible to pronounce name, it grabbed Vincent gently, and he did not fight back. His useless sword fell on the ground, and he started his journey down its throat that was of impossible size. A mouth that was filled with teeth, each the size of a decent dagger, unhinged itself like a snake's jaw when trying to swallow objects bigger than itself. But Vincent wasn't big for this creature at all. It probably did so just for show. So, you got yourself your own religion, Wilbur thought. Worshipping your horrifying power, driven by fear and praising every day that you will eat them last. That's way smarter than I assumed. Wilbur didn't have a choice. He had to watch the beast enjoying its meal. At that time, its worshippers got to their knees and stayed curled up in silence, growling and munching in peace. It had 4 eyes, or 4 visible eyes, all covered in dark feathers. Wilbur could swear that it watched him carefully, and just the sight of those eyes made him shiver in cold fear. At that point, he did not know what will happen next, nor was he certain of his tactic anymore. He underestimated the beast's 2 features: its intelligence and its might. He also understood that the legion coming down to slaughter it would only feed it further. If no action taken, Wilbur thought to himself in dreadful fear, this might be the end of Shorell as we know it. It was time to act, but what was the right action? Wilbur felt puzzled. The whole world seemed to be spinning. Without a doubt, if he will not do anything, he would end up way closer to Vincent than he would ever wish to be. There had to be a way, and he finally found it. A creature as intelligent as that had to understand sophisticated ideas like respect. Certainly, it did benefit from it, and it did not eat its followers, and in return they fed it and cared for it. It meant only that Wilbur's tactic had to be taken to a higher level. He got up. Firstly, he underestimated how dizzy he was and had to lean on a wall to catch his breath. Then he walked towards the beast. Its black eyes followed him attentively, as dark as the abyss and as vicious as only a demon could be. But he kept walking, not taking his eyes off it. Cultists that heard him approach moved, looking at him in deep surprise and fear. The beast finished its snack and waited for him to approach, still perched on a statue of a god that was not even a fraction of the might of the creature sitting on the top of it. Wilbur got close. He could smell the rotting stench of meat and blood, despite the fact that the demon before him had its mouth shut. Wilbur stood still, his back straight and his shoulders back. He did not try to dominate it, but he did not plan to curl before it, although that might have been a way to save his life. But he did not go down there for that. He had a different purpose. He knew what to do, but hesitated greatly. Fear paralyzed him. He stood like that, without moving, gazing into an abyss of eyes covered in feathers, until he realized that he might run out of the beast's patience very soon. He made himself do it. It almost hurt him in a strange way. He put his arm out with his palm uncovered. He held it towards the beast and waited. It might not have known the language. Most likely its mouth wasn't suitable for speaking at all, but it was bloody intelligent. It learned quickly, and there was only one way for Wilbur to communicate with it. He had to use what he learned as a flesh mage. The beast stared at him for a while, its eyes not showing any emotions or intentions, but then it moved. Wilbur's whole body shivered. He started to panic internally. He witnessed the monster moving so gracefully, and he couldn't even detect any changes in the air around him. That was how light and agile it was. It climbed down the statue, though, and now stood right before him. It took only one step towards it for Wilbur's hand to touch it, and he did so. He touched the feathered, ice-cold face of a monster. He did so, and, still looking in the eyes, watching for any signs of aggression, he proceeded. His hand got covered in a sticky substance that glued him to the beast. Then his skin melted with beast's feathers until he got to its scales. He got connected. And then he saw it. What Wilbur see at that time, I not only don't know, but also don't desire to know. His communication with the beast lasted several hours. Both of them standing in front of each other, Wilbur's hand melded with the beast's face, or whatever was supposed to play the role of a face. His eyes were empty, his body all sweaty and shivering. But when he finished, gently taking his hand back, he almost collapsed. The beast caught him swiftly with its massive paw, making sure he would not fall. At that point, cultists ran away, not knowing what to expect from their new, terrible god. Wilbur breathed heavily, fighting with an awful fever. Then he looked at the beast again. "I get it," he whispered to himself. "I will help you." "Are you sure it's here?" Roland asked, frowning. "Sure as hell," Rachel responded while climbing up a small hill covered with trees. "The cave is supposed to be just around the corner." Roland climbed up, although with great effort. Compared to Rachel, his load was heavy and difficult to carry, especially considering it was their third day on the road. "We take this gem, and that's the end of it, right?" Rachel asked while cutting through dense brushwood. "Yeah, that's all what this mission is about." 5,000 gold coins and all this hassle for a gem. How is that even worth this employer of yours? "It's not our concern," Roland asked reluctantly. "The guy is rich and fixated upon all this impossible." "Impossible?" Rachel turned around and looked at the paladin, grimacing. "What the hell is that about?" "You're using the word hell quite frequently for a non-believer." Roland reached her and stopped for a second. His face was covered in sweat and he was panting like crazy. "No, really, how is he making money out of this? He has to be in some way, right?" "I don't know where his wealth comes from or how is he making it," Roland said nonchalantly. "I know that he believes in something he calls the impossible. That's what all those quests are about. But what this concept is supposed to mean, I'm not sure if he even knows that. He looks for something, the equivalent of Philosopher's Stone or something equally ridiculous. Doesn't matter if he pays." "I don't know," Rachel uttered almost unconsciously. "Maybe not. How many jobs will he have for us?" "Maybe none. Maybe a lot. Look, I really don't know much about this guy and his endeavors. A portion of the money we're getting is for not asking questions like that. Let's go and just finish it. I'm tired." They traveled down the hill, and there was the entrance to a cave, just as the map had promised. And there was Wilbur, sitting on a rock, leaning on his staff. "You son of a bitch!" Rachel squeaked. "How did you do that?" "Well, I'm impressed," Roland said, smiling. "What did you find out?" Wilbur sat silently for a moment. Then he raised his head. His face was begging for just a little bit of sleep. "Let's just go inside and do what we have to do. I'm dying to go to bed." Upon saying those words, he lifted himself up slowly and entered the cave. Rachel and Roland exchanged glances and, without a word, followed him inside. The cave was completely dark and claustrophobic. It looked more like a tunnel. There was no sign of anyone being here recently, or at least passing by. Wilbur raised his staff and created an orb of light that hovered just before them, guiding them through the darkness. Wilbur went first, Rachel behind him, and Roland brought up the rear, guarding their backs. Wilbur pushed forward without stopping for a second. Sure, he had his light with him, but he didn't try to be cautious at all. As if he knew the place as good as his own, or simply had no care whatsoever. Finally, they reached the end of the narrow path that, eventually, led them to an extensive chamber the size of a small valley. It was there they saw great characters praying in two circles, one encompassing another, with their bodies covered in clothes very similar looking to what the druid living in the secluded hut wore. And by great, I mean their physicality exclusively. They were large men, both in their height and width, like bears wearing clothes. Their hands could prove that, in fact. With their hands raised, they murmured their incantations, forming 2 circles around the pedestal with a green, glimmering gem on it. "Fuck me," Rachel gasped. "There has to be like 30 of them. That's something your employer did not mention." Roland stood still without a word, gazing at the scene, filled with a strange awe. "We're going back. We'll get the gem out of the way." He didn't manage to finish his sentence because Wilbur was already going down, totally ignorant of his comrades. "Wilbur!" Rachel snarled. She was sure he heard her, but didn't react nonetheless. "It's his funeral, Rachel. He had lost his mind. Let's go," Roland said while grabbing her hand gently. Then, the unexpected happened. She took her hand back in anger and looked at him with her big, hatred-filled eyes. "How dare you?" Her words were an audio version of poison. "What kind of a leader are you? Wilbur just went on his own. We have to save him." "There's nothing we can..." Roland started, but Rachel did not want to wait. It hurt his pride greatly, and anger now dwelled in his heart as well. He hurried after her, cursing to himself. When they got down, gods only know how they were never spotted, they saw Wilbur standing in front of the wizards. Their backs were turned to him so they couldn't see him. It still was not too late. "Wilbur!" It was Roland trying to reach him. Once again, no reaction. Or, at least, no expected reaction. Because what happened next couldn't possibly be described in words. But that's the tale that has to be told, so I'll do my best. He dropped his staff, then his robes. He stood naked in front of the weird sages that now noticed him. They stopped their chanting and broke the circles they stood in. Grey and brown beards sticking out of their hoods watched him carefully. And then he changed. He grew instantly, as if an explosion would inflate him suddenly. His muscles popped out unnaturally. He grew bigger than any ogre. His skin turned into scales. His face, now at least 10 times its current size, became covered in black feathers. The whole process was supported by an awful scream coming out of him. Firstly human, helpless and filled with agony, then demonic, and sounded like an awful laugh. The druids stepped back. Their faces were invisible, but fear could be felt in the air. None of it helped them a single bit, though. He jumped. Swift and fast like the wind, he reached them and his very strike threw them away like empty boxes, despite the fact that each of them had to weigh at least 400 pounds. They cast spells, but they were merely fireworks for the beast in rage. Covered in fire, darkness, and poison, the beast seemed to be completely unaffected. Roland and Rachel watched this scene totally paralyzed. The natural human reaction for any situation the mind is unfamiliar with. Freeze. That's why they never run away. But the beast wasn't after them. When it finished, which meant that it tore apart every single being in the room, it stopped. Stood still, covered in blood, partially its own, but way more of its prey's, and Roland with Rachel could clearly see stains of burned meat on its body. Spells had affected it, and it was hurt. It just could withstand all the pain it had to suffer. The beast fell down on its knees and, supporting its massive upper body on its twisted talons, it vomited a large object. So large that it could have been considered a bird instead. This thing was Wilbur. The real Wilbur. Covered in a viscous substance, he rose, naked and proud. Standing in front of the beast, they looked deep into each other's eyes. Then, Wilbur lifted his hand and put it gently on the monster's jaw, petting it with affection. His friend made noises way different from those it made before. Now it purred and squeaked. Roland and Rachel watched it all in awe, shock, and fear. But none of them moved. It all lasted some short time, and then the beast got up in one big jump, and then ran insanely fast out of the cave. "What was that about?" Roland asked, approaching the naked Wilbur while still being a fair distance from him. "It was a goodbye to another lonely soul that you witnessed," he replied calmly, almost hypnotized. "You're fucked up for real, man," Rachel said with her face twisted in disgust. "I am," Wilbur said calmly while trying to clean himself from the substance he had been covered in. "And it is my burden of solitude to be the way I am. It was also the burden of that creature. But this one was far luckier than me. This one, I was able to provide for it a taste of revenge upon its creators." "Revenge?" Roland asked, surprised. "Revenge for what?" "For being created in the first place, of course." Wilbur looked at him. He looked absent. "And left alone with whatever it was. And the creature was what its creators hid in hearts. Greed, hatred, weakness of character. It will have to live with it and die with it, but at least the ones that are responsible are dead now. Is the human race equally privileged?" "That's blasphemy!" Roland exploded. "One more word and I will cut your head off!" "No, you won't." Wilbur pointed out the gem resting on a pedestal in the center of the cave. "You will bring this to your employer, and you will gather us again, and again, and we will work until our death, gathering things that we are doomed to lose in the end. That's what you'll do. And you will let me live. You need company in your struggle. In the end, the tragedy of life is so unbearable that we cannot help but enjoy bleeding with others." Wilbur took the ropes from one of the slaughtered druids and covered himself. Then, silently, he left. His job was done, and he would meet Roland and Rachel again, when Roland will come back from his mysterious employer that he claims that he does not know, and bring another task to fulfill. But now he could rest. He wished to work no more. Thank you for listening to this story. This is not, of course, where it ends, for there are many other adventures Roland, Wilbur, and Rachel will participate in. The next story will be a little bit different, though. With this one, we'll try to understand Roland's past. We'll come back to the days while he was still merely a knight, preparing to become a paladin. After 3 months of intense meditation at Northern Peak, it is time for Roland to come back to continue his training. However, the road back happens to not be an easy one. Dark clouds hover above him, and only the light of his faith will be able to guide him through the undead land filled with wraths and death hounds. there is one minor change that I have to announce in here. I came to the conclusion that publishing whole stories at once instead of dividing them into parts will be a better idea. That's why I will be forced to publish fortnightly rather than weekly. But worry not. Every 2 weeks I will be ready with another story for you, delivered fully to wherever you listen to this podcast. So, thank you once again for your attention. Have a great time being you. And I wish you all the most wonderful things in the world.